Hey there, Denise. Welcome to the Vineyard Underground podcast. I'm so glad you can join me today to talk about how winemaking starts in the vineyard. You know me, I'm a viticulturist, so of course I'm going to say it starts in the vineyard, but then it's all in your hands and the winemaker's hands and all the winemakers you help. So before we dive into our topic for today's episode, I want to talk a little bit about your background, your love of winemaking. I know it started in high school, and I remember this because when I was a graduate student at Penn State, in case people don't know out there, Denise is also a Penn Stater. And so I met you when you were still in high school. I was just getting into graduate school. We don't have to talk about how long ago that was, but let's just say it was more than 20 years ago, less than 25. But I remember there was this young person in the room at this grape grower meeting, which wasn't very common. And you were there with your ag teacher from your school. And I was, maybe 21 years old or so. And I thought, this is pretty cool that I learned that I wanted to be in the wine industry at such a young age. But then here's this person who's probably 18 or 17. I don't know. Tell us the story about how you got started, because I was really impressed that someone of that age knew what they wanted to do. And you weren't even old enough to drink wine yet.
I mean, I remember you were the only person who came over and talked to me. So yes, winemaking starts in the vineyard. I always like to say, though, it ends in the winery. So just keep that in mind. But yes, I was about 15, I think, 14 when I first started reading about grapes and wine. My interest started actually after reading a Penn State research magazine. They publish these about every year. And there was an article in there about grape phylloxera that was going on at Penn State. And I, for some reason, was really captivated by this story. So my interest in reading about phylloxera actually eventually connected me to the then newly hired Mark Chen, who we both know and adore in this industry. And Mark is really the individual that connected me with the wine industry when I was only 14, 15, 16 years old, by going to extension events. Now, all of those extension events were viticulture oriented. So my background really started on the grape growing side. But I also had this really good capability of being able to connect what was going on in the vineyard and then being able to explain how that influenced the wine. And Mark's really the person that saw that. And so I started redirecting my interest in wine by competing in state science fairs. And I did that through most of my high school career. Again, Mark helped introduce me to people that helped me design those experiments and work on them. And they were successful enough that it got some recognition from Lallemand, who is a enological supply company.
Yes,
Lallemand, they hired me after high school to work at their Toulouse office to do some research on Enococcus eni, which is the malolactic bacteria. So really, high school kind of oriented me into this wine path. I did end up going to Penn State, getting a BS in food science, and then later I went to Virginia Tech and got a master's in food science and technology. But all of those experiences were still very much oriented towards enology, the science of winemaking.
Let's just start with pre-harvest. So roughly, let's say 4 to 8 weeks before harvest. What should growers be doing at this stage to improve wine quality?
Yeah, I'm glad you said 4 to 8 weeks, because you really do. I've noticed there's always this natural tension during this time of year because this is the big vineyard growing season, right? But those 1 to 2 months, maybe 3 months before the grapes actually come in, there's actually a lot that needs done in the winery as well. And it's very easy if you're an operation where you're both hats, working in the vineyard and in the winery. It's very, very easy to ignore the wines because there's no visual cue that something's going on with the wines. As you know, the vineyard, there's a very strong visual cue. Something's going on, something needs done. But essentially, in these, let's say up to 3 months before harvest begins, I'm really pushing people to get their wines for the season bottled. So you should not be bottling during harvest. Now, I know that some operations run into this simply from a logistical challenge with mobile bottlers. That's kind of a different conversation. But in general, I want the annual wines bottled, by the time before harvest actually begins. And if you can give yourself a little bit of a break in between bottling and harvest starting, even better. The other big thing people have to do is check their equipment. And last year, I will say, is the first year that, and last year was the 2022 harvest, is the first year where I was contacted pretty regularly on equipment breaking down and then not being able to fix it because of supply chain delays, lack of availability of parts, or technical service. And so I would say this year it's even more important to make sure that your equipment is working and operational much further in advance compared to like when harvest is actually starting. So that's the annual maintenance. It should just be a routine that you're doing that with your, presses, crusher distemmers, pumps, etc.
So Denise, you've gotten us all the way to harvest day. That's awesome. But now what, right? So if you're making the wine in addition to growing the grapes, these next few weeks are crucial for wine quality. And what are the considerations that these grower/winemakers or the team needs to take in the post-harvest phase? So after you've gotten the initial numbers, let's run with that.
Yeah, and this is really the place where everyone gets complacent. The wine's been made, and so they just assume everything's good. But that's not how it is. It's just like the vineyard. You have to stay on top of it. You have to continue to monitor it. Again, this is where wine analysis is going to come into play, measuring SO2, sulfur dioxide, once a month, every other month, depending on your winemaking conditions, but also checking your SO2 after you make an addition. A lot of people make an addition and assume it's okay, but you don't know if it's okay or not. You have to check to see how the SO2 has taken in that wine. I always also tell people to do like a harvest review immediately after harvest. So this is going to be sitting down with your team, listing things out like what went well, what went wrong, what needs fixed, what do we need to buy for next year, that kind of review, because you're going to forget within a few weeks. And then finally, updating your compliance documentation. So I tend to push this for January. I really want people to work on improving their inventory, their traceability documentation, and then reviewing their SOPs or SSOPs, their standard operating procedures during that time. So you can do this in small time spurts. You don't have to like hunker down and work on it for a week straight, but you do want to do this every year as part of the necessary documentation for wineries.
You've already mentioned a few of the parameters that the winemaker and the grape grower need to discuss and communicate about. What are the most critical things for a grower to focus on for wine quality at harvest itself? So we're getting to the stage where we're ready to pick and we're making decisions.
Again, knowing what's going to happen to the fruit here is a really big advantage. So if you did that planning, you're in a good spot. You want to get all of your harvest equipment set up, cleaned, sanitized, and remember, you want to do an immediate sanitation before the fruit touches the equipment. Sanitation is really important. It often gets undermined through this process, but that's a really important part of harvest. And then also, hopefully you were proactive enough to get all of your enological supplies in, things like your yeast, your acids, your sugar, et cetera, et cetera. So because we don't live on the West Coast, if you don't have those things available to you at the start of harvest, then you may be delayed in some of your processes if you don't have them proactively sitting at the winery. So having those supplies ahead of time is really important. And then finally, I would say, make sure you have a way of measuring YAN, which is yeast available nitrogen or yeast assimilable nitrogen, depending on what you read. This number often gets overlooked, but it is actually very important because it dictates your nutrient supplementation strategy during the fermentation process. And it's the number one way of reducing the formation of hydrogen sulfide or the reduction, the stinky note that we don't want in wine.